Good evening, everyone. I'm Gloria Kenyon, Senior Public Programs Coordinator here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Renwick Gallery. Thank you for joining us tonight for the last talk in our new Writings in American Art series for this season. We are honored to be joined tonight by historian and author Glenn Adamson. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Please use the Q&A feature to pose questions to the author, and we will share audience questions at the end of the program. Please see the chat for additional information and helpful links throughout the program. We are thrilled that Sam and the Renwick Gallery are reopened to the public. We are currently opened via timed passes Wednesday through Sunday, and our team is putting a link in the chat that you can follow to reserve time passes for your visit. Please stay tuned to our website for announcements of our upcoming fall season of programming. It's now my pleasure to introduce Glenn Adamson, curator, writer, and historian based in New York. He has previously been director of the Museum of Arts and Design, head of research at the V&A, and curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. Adamson's publications include Thinking Through Craft, The Craft Reader, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion, co-edited with Jane Pavitt, The Invention of Craft, Art in the Making, co-authored with Julia Bryan-Wilson, and Fewer Better Things, The Hidden Wisdom of Objects. His newest book, which we are discussing tonight, is Craft and American History, published this year by Bloomsbury. Welcome, Glenn. I am excited to talk with you this evening.
It's great to be with you, Gloria. So happy to have this chance to talk with you.
Thank you. I'd actually like to start with the last line of your book, because for me, it's an excellent summary of your driving premise of the entire book. You say, craft is not just about striving for perfection, but also making a reasonable peace with what's possible. So, can craft save America? Maybe so, if we all get behind this idea. Our shared past is what the future will be made from, the best that we can. Where do you see craft in all the ways you describe it throughout the book coming together to get behind that idea?
Yeah, thank you, Gloria. It's a nice place to start, starting at the end, because it's really maybe the reason I wrote the book. I was looking out there at the landscape of American culture, American politics over the past few years. Obviously, as a person who'd been studying craft for a long time, I saw it through that lens. And it struck me that one of the few things that everyone that I could see seemed to still be able to get behind was craft. In other words, one of the very few common tissues, common grounds of American culture. Red state, blue state, purple state, didn't seem to matter. You could find craft everywhere out there. And so that motivated me to write this book, which I think of as a history of America told through the eyes of its artisans. That particular line that you quoted was inspired actually by something in a book called Working by Studs Terkel. And what he did was, in a way, maybe similar motivation to what I was trying to do. He went around and talked to all these different people in the 1960s and 70s who were workers of all kinds, not just craftspeople, but also, telephone operators and lawyers and everyone he could find, and asked them about their work experience. And one artisan said to him that, you talk about getting things to the thousandth of an inch, but actually everything's always got a lot of give in it. And real craftsmanship isn't insane perfectionism. In other words, it's not striving so much for the perfect that the good gets lost along the way. It's actually having a good judgment about what needs to be done. And I thought there was something about that moderate pragmatism that seemed to have gone missing in a lot of American culture. And that's one of the values, I guess, that I'm trying to celebrate in the book.
Mm, I like that. The good enough will get us through. You kind of touch, especially with Studs Terkel's working, about different ways that class and maleness and whiteness have dominated the craft conversations throughout much of American history. But something I really appreciated was you took care to bring forward the stories of marginalized people throughout American history and craft. And for those who haven't read the book, you start with the colonies and bring us all the way to the present day. And you do a good job of pulling out these key stories. But how did you go about discovering these untold stories of craft history?
Yeah, it's maybe a book of its time in the sense that I was very, very conscious of demographics while writing it. And ultimately, the book is really structured around four different groups. one of which is the white working class, male and female, by the way. But that sort of class idea that's expressed by labor unions in more recent years or in earlier years would have been understood in terms of trade societies, for example, apprenticeship structures. So the working class is one focus. I also thought a lot about women's histories in relation to craft, and also the histories of two ethnic groups, African Americans and Native Americans, indigenous people. And, I think those histories had been written previously, but it was an opportunity for me to read that literature and to weave those stories together, perhaps in a new way. You know, the history of labor unions and the history of African American labor, for example, obviously have a lot to do with one another. And in fact, racial politics have a lot to say about why labor unions developed the way that they did, their blind spots, the shifts that occurred in the 1960s in the politics of work. But by telling the deeper, more continuous stories of gender, of race, as well as region and class together, you just get a much, much more insightful picture. And I will say that although obviously we're hosted tonight by the American Art Museum, the Smithsonian, one kind of funny thing that happened as a result of that idea is that although I'm trained as an art historian, I ended up writing about a lot of things that just had very little to do with art at all. So, I was actually thinking about plumbers and bricklayers and construction workers, not only about furniture makers or ceramic artists or glass blowers that would make the kind of thing that end up in a place like the Renwick or the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So it was also a matter of looking at a bigger picture in terms of the kinds of things that people make, as well as the kinds of people that are makers.
Yeah, that was something I noticed, that you include brick makers, masons, factory laborers under this craft umbrella, and the importance of the skill sets they developed throughout the growth of mechanization, as well as in some other ways. Why do you think that this craft history has often been overlooked or considered separately from the more traditional craft?
Well, I think there's maybe one reason it's a bit more innocent, which is just that it's a little hard. If you have an exceptional object that you can stick in a case or put on a platform, it's just frankly a lot easier for a museum to communicate that way. The object is charismatic, you can hang a story on it. And so that part of it is, of course, understandable. It's a lot more difficult to tell the story of, I don't know, somebody who's building or repairing machines in a 19th century factory. That's quite difficult to get across, maybe. But of course, there's also another reason, which is just power, right? So the stories, particularly of women and Black and Native artisans, are absolutely smothered by the neglect of history. And they have not really had the kind of presence, even in craft history, much less American history written more broadly, that they deserve. I'm really of the opinion, having done the work on this book, that America was essentially built by Black working class female and to some extent also Native makers, although obviously there's a reality of displacement and even genocide that Native populations are undergoing. So that's a very different story, a different kind of marginalization. But if you think about the role that enslaved populations, for example, had in building not just the South, but the whole country, and the degree to which those stories have not been told, it's quite appalling. I find that focusing on the issue of skill as a way of unveiling those stories is really, really helpful, because it allows you to understand these people's lives not only in a way that gives them a kind of inherent respect, but also maybe dramatically shows what was at stake in their lives. And I was very inspired here by something that Frederick Douglass wrote just before the Civil War. He wrote a short essay on the theme "Learn Trades or Die," and the point that he was making was that Negroes—that's the word he was using at the time, not one we would use today— African Americans, we would say, for those people, learning a trade was actually a matter of life and death, because it was the difference between working in the fields with a very short life expectancy and obviously horrendous conditions, and doing something like what he did, which was to be a ship's caulker on the docks of Baltimore, which of course was not a good life, but it was marginally better. In fact, in his case, it actually gave him the opportunity to effect his escape from captivity ultimately. So he's very, very keenly aware of the transformative role that a craft skill could play in a Black person's life. And I found that kind of narrative to be both upsetting and inspiring in equal measure. You know, it's a way of, I guess, pushing through the cliches of enslavement, um, and having a more textured understanding of what that reality was all about. And by the way, you know, there are also Black artisans before the Civil War who were free Blacks. There were even some Black artisans who owned other Black people as slaves. So it's a very, very complicated picture. And to my mind, the more fully you tell that picture, the more we understand the history that's brought us to the present day.
Yes, throughout the book, you are really showing us this bigger picture, and I kind of felt like there's more book to be had beyond what you write, because as you're talking, there's these greater stories, and that you can only tell so much. But something that I think has happened in our history is there's a lot of nostalgia, and this I think this ties to the learn trades or die, and this desire for self-sufficiency that drives craft practice and the way that craft has influenced different ideas and the way we understand it. And why is nostalgia so powerful in our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of craft?
Mm. Well, to understand that, you really have to go back to the beginning of the story, maybe even not just in America, but think about Britain and the Industrial Revolution. I did write a previous book called The Invention of Craft. And the argument of that project briefly is that craft is invented as the opposite of industry. So, in other words, once you have the Industrial Revolution and you have machines and you have progress and efficiency and mass production, craft is kind of what's left. It's almost defined negatively as the backward looking thing, the traditional thing, the thing that's not going to be economically competitive. Of course, at the same time, this is an imperial country, Britain at the time, so craft is also defined as what's happening in India, let's say, and other colonial possessions. So there's a lot of things to do with gender and race and geography there too. But when we're thinking about nostalgia, the most important thing to remember is that craft is, if you like, ideologically framed or symbolically framed as the past, the way things used to be made. And the whole point is not to do it that way anymore because it doesn't pay as well and it's going to eventually be competed out of existence. So by the time you get to the late 19th century, the arts and crafts movement, or the 1920s and the colonial revival, you have what you might think of as a counter move, where the somewhat dehumanizing conditions of the factory and also the sameness of mass produced goods have started to seem really, really unsatisfying to people. And one option that's put on the table is to embrace craft as a way of going, quote, back to the way things used to be in the colonial period, let's say in America. And that's when, especially in the context of colonial revival, you get some very kind of airbrushed and idealized versions of what actually happened in the 17th and 18th century. I mean, for one thing, race is depicted hardly at all, and if so, in a very misleading way in that period. But what's really going on there is that the past is being used as a stick to beat the present with. The great irony, of course, is that actually, when you look at the story in its real full dimensions, rather than through this nostalgic lens, you find a few surprising things, one of which is that the Industrial Revolution was actually run by artisans, by craftspeople. Because if you think about it, if you're going to build a steam engine or a machine loom or a cotton gin or anything else, you're probably going to need to build it by hand, at least at first. And craftspeople are absolutely crucial all the way through the 19th century. You know, even Henry Ford started as a skilled machinist, right? So for one thing, artisans are absolutely at the heart of the Industrial Revolution and driving it. They're really its protagonists. But also that idea of craft as a more progressive force in American culture goes into lots of other areas too, including, of course, the arts, where if you want to innovate and generate new ideas, you're probably going to need a skilled person or yourself be a skilled person in order to do it. So I'm a big proponent, for example, of thinking of avant-garde art whether it's sculpture or painting or design or glass, whatever medium is, to think of all of that as driven by craft. It's almost like the engine under the hood of the car. By the way, cars are also handcrafted before they're mass produced, because they have to be prototyped in clay or whatever material. So you have this really funny situation where, on the one hand, craft, as you say, is subjected to all of this nostalgia, like a blanket of sentimental nostalgia that sort of prevents you from seeing it clearly. You know, if you imagine a blanket laying over something, you sort of see the bumps, but you don't really see the full picture. And in fact, if you lift the blanket up, what you see is that craft is a very, very progressive force in American culture, much more than it is just an anchor of tradition.
I love that, like the blanket over it. It also makes me think of Wendell Castle's Ghost Clock at the Renwick,
Right.
which to just make another craft connection. But there's nothing to lift up there. So in talking about these driving forces, something I see come up a lot and sort of related to this are these ideas of collectivism versus independence, I feel. And then there were times also, and maybe I just perceived it this way, but kind of falling along gender lines. In one chapter, you talk about Henry David Thoreau and then Beecher, and how they kind of each like Thoreau goes off by himself into the woods, and Beecher creates this like collective community. Um, so these ideas often get put in opposition to one another, but are they actually in opposition? Do they hinder or help the concept of craft? Like, how are these people and like these ideas continuing this craft history?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a great question. And in a way that cuts right to the heart of what the book is about in terms of American identity. And the way that I have come to think about this is that although individualism and collectivism are in fact in opposition, which maybe just that's kind of obvious, right? Craft is maybe the place where those two ideas can be worked out and brought into some kind of alignment. It might be worth saying, just to start with, that America has a very weak tradition of collective action compared to other countries. And all you have to do is think about what happened in the 19th century in Europe, the revolutions of 1848, the Paris Commune in 1870, as compared to what happened in America. Admittedly, we had the Civil War, which was a sort of mass experience. But what we didn't have was really successful collective labor uprising. And we have never had that, no Russian Revolution here, right? So what we have had instead is a kind of undying commitment to the idea of individualism. And that goes right back, well, it goes back before the revolution, but in the history of the United States of America, it goes right back to the Jeffersonian idea of the yeoman farmer proudly out there on his land, or Longfellow's blacksmith under the spreading chestnut tree, the honest sweat of his brow, toiling not for any other man, all that stuff. So you have this really kind of mythos, if you like, of what was often called the self-made man. Benjamin Franklin, another figure who was really taken up as a kind of emblematic figure in that regard, born as a printer's apprentice, skipped out on his apprenticeship legally, by the way, and then ran from Boston to Philadelphia, and of course became the Ben Franklin that we all know and love through the sort of his own personal ingenuity and hard work, and wrote all of this stuff, including Poor Richard's Almanac, to encourage other people to do the same. And that idea of the self-made man filters right down even to the present day, that Frederick Douglass subscribed to it. Gustav Stickley, the great arts and crafts furniture maker, subscribed to it. You can even see elements of it in presidential biographies from, Lincoln on forwards, the idea of being born in a log cabin, handcrafted log cabin. And it's fascinating to see even someone like Donald Trump, who could not be less self-made, try to appropriate that language in his own rhetoric. Is really an essential part of the furniture in American political life. So on the one hand, you have all of that individuality, kind of overdetermined individuality, and the craftsperson, like Longfellow's blacksmith or Franklin the printer, is taken as emblematic of that, representative of it. But, and here's the kicker, at the same time, craftspeople actually depend on one another. and they do work in teams. And even if you're a really, really, really independent studio furniture maker like Wendell Castle, who you just mentioned, you might have apprentices and assistants, which Wendell certainly did at some points in his career, but you're also going to be depending on lots of other artisans to provide you the materials and the tools and so on that you need. And that still is true today. It certainly was true in the 18th and 19th century. So what you have is then a way of life, craft is a way of life that seems symbolic of individualism for good reason, because people are financially self-standing, self-sufficient, independent, autonomous. But on the other hand, they're absolutely plugged into their communities of other craftspeople, and of course those who buy their work. And the classic thing is, to be a bespoke shoemaker or tailor or weaver, and you personally know the people that are going to buy your work. So there's that idea of individuality, but also interdependence, and craft is the place in the culture where those two things are worked out. And it's so important because we don't do a good job of that in America. We don't do a good job of thinking about individual rights, individual needs, and even the idea of individuality itself within the social fabric. It comes to seem like a real conflict to us. And it's craftspeople who I think really, for me, show you how those two things can be brought together. The last thing I'll say about this, I'm kind of going on this topic for a while because it's so important to the book. It's kind of the heart of the book. But the one other thing I would say about this is that if you think about the 18th and 19th century, communities were basically made up of craftspeople. So for example, Allentown, Pennsylvania, as in the Billy Joel song, that town was founded in the 18th century. And you can look at the list of people, so we have the first list of deed holders for that town, and practically every single person was a craftsperson, right? Because they had to be, otherwise how are you going to build a town? And you need your miller, you need your house builder, you need your cobbler, etc. And of course, eventually, Allentown becomes, steel furnace capital, and eventually that fails in the 1970s. Billy Joel writes his song, and the town is literally hollowed out. What does it not have anymore? Craftspeople. And because the craftspeople are the ones who are both individual and also community-based, think of what's lost in that process. And that in a way is the tragedy of the story, that as craft is pushed to the margins of the economy, it's not so much that the objects get worse, probably they do to some extent, in some ways they get better, some more, they're more perfectly made in factories, and they're certainly cheaper, but what we lose is the people from our towns and our cities who are kind of the glue that holds it all together. There's a reason that they sent Paul Revere out on the midnight ride to say the British are coming, because everybody trusted him. And that was the role of the craftsperson historically. Fortunately, I think now we are having kind of craft revival. Maybe we'll get onto that in a bit. And I think that energy is coming back in some ways, but you can see how much is missing when it's not there.
Oh, I feel like I could just ask you so many follow-up questions about that because you are right. And throughout the book, I really like your framing of you need the individual with but interconnected to everyone else and touching everyone else. And then also, I have a degree in studio art and pottery, and to finish my degree, I had to make exact perfect replicas of everything. I had to become this machine. And so thinking about how these shifted expectations of craft, like I'm a person sitting at a wheel making, but I'm expected to make them machine like and make them all exactly the same. And so what is lost in all of that? How is it craft if it looks exactly, if it doesn't have that handmade touch?
Yeah.
And then am I trading my coffee mugs for my shoes? Like that's, where are these experiences coming in and how has it changed? Because, Etsy doesn't do object trades.
Yeah, just
So,
quickly on that, sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
It's such a great example because it also shows you that craft is embodied. And so for you, making perfect cylinders or whatever you were doing, perfect pots, that's like a musician playing their scales, right? And it's the fact that you can do that then would allow you to go on and become a creative, expressive artist. I mean, Peter Volkas, the ceramic artist, I helped curate a show that came to the Renwick about him years ago. He's a perfect example because before he started making abstract expressionist sculpture, so-called, and you can debate the degree to which it was actually abstract expressionist, but that's how people have often described it. But before he started doing that, he was the best thrower around. He was getting, prizes in all of these regional craft fairs for his tureens, and that was the skill that allowed him to go on and make the radical work that he did, just like Picasso knew how to draw before he did Cubism.
Yes, yeah, you've got to walk before you can run. Peter Voulkos is a really good example of that. Yes. So actually, speaking of Peter, I'm going to bring us into the 20th century. You touched on the 18th and the 19th century and mechanization, but um, there's so many themes that just repeat throughout the book. As I was taking notes as I was reading, I was like, oh, I feel like this is popping up again in this chapter. We just saw, and some of the same cultural struggles that we're seeing in the 21st century started to, I think, crop up in the 19th century, but then really bloom in the 20th. Things like the romanticization of the past, the idea of real America, the idea that authenticity, kind of, is key. So these same ideas that are coming to the fore again, particularly in this last half decade, how is that connected to our understanding of craft and ourselves as American? I think you started to touch on it in that previous answer and the interconnectedness, but like, is there a broader picture that is tied to this idea of real America and authentic America?
Yeah, I guess one way of thinking about that is to consider the question against the backdrop of digital experience, which, not to belabor the point, everybody's so familiar with this, but now we've come to associate that with fake news and, the so-called deep fake, you can't tell what you're looking at anymore, and the sort of echo chamber of opinion making and so on. And the result of that is that there's been a kind of hunger for authenticity. Authenticity here meaning just really a sure place to stand. And I think craft um, comes back into the frame there precisely because you can't spin it, right? So if you're a maker, or even if you spent a lot of time around objects, if you look at somebody else's work, you know exactly what they can do and what they can't. There's just no place to hide. In the same way that when a musician hears another musician play within the same genre, the same instrument, they know, right? You can't fool them. And because craft is so physical and embodied, as we were saying before, and also because even if we're not makers, we kind of know, when you lift a coffee mug, does it please your hand? Does it have the right weight? Do you actually want to drink out of it? All those things seem so palpably and unalterably honest in their nature. And of course, analog, so tactile, physical, something you can actually literally hold on to. And so many other things in our lives are not like that, right? They're slippery, they're complicated, they elude our grasp, both literally and figuratively. So I think that the reason we're having a kind of craft revival again, probably the most intense one that we've had since the late 1960s when the counterculture, the hippie thing was happening, or since the arts and crafts movement 100 years ago. I think the reason that that's happening now is largely to do with that desire for authenticity. But again, as so often, there's a wrinkle and a kind of contradictoriness, because I think the other reason it's happening, ironically, is because the internet is helping it happen. And there are so many artisans now that I know who might be making, I don't know, handmade beer glasses for, craft beer drinking, or they might be making shoes, or they might be knitting, clothes for dogs, whatever it is. They have their companies on Instagram and other social media platforms, right? And that allows them to cut out the middle person, to sell to people that they would never be able to identify as clients otherwise. And it radically increases the efficiency of their distribution. And it makes businesses that would not have been viable previously into perfectly decent economic concerns. So there's a really funny thing that's happening where craft is thriving both because of the internet and in spite of it at the same time, or both because it's compatible with the internet and also because it seems like it's equal and natural opposite. It's totally fascinating.
I'm going to put a pin in that and we're going to come back to particularly this moment because I have a lot of questions well, not a lot, but some questions about that. To go back to the 20th century or 20th century in your book, and as you're moving through the mid 20th century in the opening of chapter 7, I think we're in the 60s, and you tell us this about this the Huf family, and I'll let you describe them because they're so fascinating. And just how many families were like this who wanted to create this world for themselves, and how does that reflect the wider culture of the era?
Yeah. The Huf family is an amazing thing. It was just an article that I ran into in a sort of home magazine from the 1950s. And well, the first line of that chapter is, "You would have hated to live next to the Huf family," because they're like this cartoon of a picture perfect family, and they're totally self-reliant in everything they do. I think they lived in the Southwest. I think it was Arizona, and they built their own patio and they built their own fireplace. The boy makes his own airplanes out of balsa wood. The daughter makes her own clothing and makes clothing for other people in the family. They grow their own vegetables. Every single thing they do is by hand and done by themselves. And the reason I thought that was so fascinating is because, although it's an exaggeration, they're a real family, by the way. I looked them up, and you can detect their later success in life. No surprise, they all go on to be very successful people. But although they're an exaggerated example, they're in some ways very typical of the post-war boom in what we call the DIY movement. So this is not really a craft revival in the sense that the arts and crafts movement was, or the later counterculture, because it's not so ideological in nature. It's not really meant to be symbolic. It's more like, you come back from the war, gotten married, started a family, now you're out in a suburb and you're going to improve your life. And so intense was this phenomenon that, statistically speaking, the sales of power tools skyrocketed in the 1950s, as not coincidentally did the number of household hospitalization incidents, because people, cutting themselves with their power saws as soon as they buy them because they've never been trained to use them. So you have this kind of new frontier. It's been called the crabgrass frontier, very memorably by one historian. The front lawn being, the new horizon, and the garage or the den become the new sites for America's craft activity. And this is, by the way, also very much a cross-class and cross-racial phenomenon. It is mostly discussed as a very gendered white thing in period literature, and even to some extent by historians. Again, women sewing their dresses, men getting their power tools up and running in their garage. But it actually was much more broadly shared, families working together in groups. So the Hofs were sort of a great way into that story.
I feel like I I feel like, I mean, I live in the suburbs and I still feel like I know people like that who are like, let's build our patio, let's build our garden. And then over the last year, especially, I think as folks have spent more time at home, there's been
Yes.
more of an exploration of that in our crabgrass frontiers. I like that
Yeah,
phrase a
this year
lot.
has been it's been a real acquaintance with that. But not only just during the lockdown, because you have to think there's a reason that Lowe's and Home Depot are two of the most successful companies in the country, and it's not because only professionals are going there, right? So there's still this idea, even if it's to some extent aspirational. I always think that if you had to say what is the ultimate example of a late 20th century craft object, the right answer might be a stack of unread magazines in the corner of a living room, right? Because it's again the way that craft travels as an idea that's so brilliantly manipulated by people like Martha Stewart, for example. And the whole point of Martha Stewart is that you can't actually be Martha Stewart. So she's this kind of unreachable, almost comically unreachable goal, kind of like the Hofs were in their own time. And that's part of the whole, I guess, the whole attraction, the whole magic of craft as an economic project in the late 20th century.
Aspirational craft.
Yeah.
Before I get to my next question, I have a friend who said to me that buying supplies for my craft hobby and actually doing the craft are two different hobbies. Like
Yeah.
buying the things is the hobby, and then also like making them. And I think that's very much what this is. Like the stack of magazines, that it's the pleasure of the thinking I might do this.
Yeah.
Um, You
Yes,
mentioned Peter.
buying the wool,
Yeah,
not just knitting it.
yes, exactly. I'll just keep a pile of wool because who knows when you need that. Um, you mentioned Peter Volkos and his talent and his important influence in studio art, studio craft world, and especially because that is my background is understanding writing about studio craft. But um, there's somewhat of an outsized influence in craft history of the 1960s studio craft movement. And throughout the book, you take us all the way back to the colonies to show how craftsmanship was integral to the formation of the United States and our understanding of ourselves. And we've talked about that this evening. But why do you think some of these other histories have been pushed aside for the more recent historical ideas perpetuated by the studio craft movement?
Yeah, I guess it's worth saying that in the book, I really tried to right size the craft movements, both the arts and crafts movement and the studio craft movement, so they don't get a lot of pages,
They do
which
not.
might have surprised people who are familiar with my other work. I've written a whole biography of Lenore Tawney, who was the most important figure in post-war weaving, for example, and I've done this exhibition about Volkas. And I think Volkas only gets a few sentences where I compare him to a hot rod maker, and Tommy gets a couple of sentences. So the reason for that is really that, just as you say, that had an outsized influence. And I think the reasons for that really have to do with what I would call a bad case of art envy. So I think this gets us into some sort of complicated and contentious territory, but it is super interesting too. Once you have a situation where craft is marginalized, of course, what it needs to do is find a margin to live in, right? So that there's all sorts of ways that that plays out. We just were talking about one of them, which is hobbies or amateur craft, right? So craft is no longer the center of the economy, but it can still be a hobby that you don't do for money. Or you could say craft is no longer the center of the economy, so maybe it could be an art practice. It can be set not to the side in the romper room, but it could somehow take a position out front and lead, right? And that's where people like Tawny or Wendell Castle or Peter Volkas or Art Smith, the jeweler, would be another great example of that in that medium. Just to mention an African American figure here, because there were quite a few who were very significant in the studio craft movement. So that's where craft could perhaps live. It could find a new role that way. And on the one hand, I think that's great, because the idea of craft and fine art actually go together beautifully in some respects. As I said, craft is like the engine in the car. It's like the creative fuel in some ways. On the other hand, I think there was an unfortunate misunderstanding that craft and art were similar concepts or similar words, which, if you think about it for even a half second, is obviously not true, because craft's relationship to art is probably a lot more like the relationship between art and, let's say, color or materials, right? So craft has something to do with art. I mean, you couldn't make an artwork without thinking about craft, even if you decided you don't want it to be made skillfully. That's also a decision, in the same way that you can make a painting that's either monochromatic or has every color in the rainbow in it. So in the same way, again, that you can't really make art without thinking about color, you probably can't make art without thinking about craft. But nobody has arguments about whether color and art are the same thing or different things, or what's the relationship between color and art. I think probably because there isn't this other issue about how much things are going to be sold for, and does a functional pot get to be sold for as much as a sculpture. But that's really not a great reason to have fallen into the confusion that we've fallen into. So what I always try to do is really try to clarify the situation by saying craft is basically a verb, right? Craft is the way that we make things, and you can make anything in a skillful, sort of human scaled way. And to me, it counts as craft, again, including sculpture, including paintings. But that doesn't mean that we should misunderstand them as being overlapping categories, like some kind of Venn diagram. I just don't look at it that way at all.
That's fascinating and very thought provoking. And I feel like we're going to get a lot of questions about that. So I look forward to that. This is our last question, actually, before we turn to audience questions. And we started to talk about this a little bit with Martha Stewart and hobbies and obviously because of when your book was published, you briefly touch on the beginning of last year and the DIY mass culture that quickly grew up out of necessities, as well as like the desire for mutual aid and helping one another. And we also saw the growth of other types of DIY, so much so that in addition to all the lumber purchased at Home Depot, the New York Times ran a piece in May of last year about how to create your own dyes with food scraps. My favorite being you get pink from avocado. Do you think this is a continuation of the ideals of craftivism and DIY that we've seen in craft in the last decade, or are we seeing a shift? We started to talk about this a little bit, and I'd love to see like where you think craft is going. Is it changing? Is this a continuation? Where are we headed?
It's always difficult for a historian to answer that question, but you're kind of asking for it if you read a book like this. I do think that we're undergoing an intense um, uptick of interest in craft, and because of the very nature of the enterprise, I expect that to be very long lasting because craft, in fact, is a lifelong commitment, right? So people who are in their 20s now that are getting involved with craft either as makers or as consumers or just admirers are very likely to keep that as some aspect of their lives going forward. I also think that the digital revolution that we've seen starting to transform workshop habits has really only just gotten going. I think we're barely out of the sort of early halting stages of what I would describe as path dependency. In other words, everything that's 3D printed looks kind of the same because 3D printers have a very limited set of capabilities. And now we seem to be getting out of that situation, partly because people are using them more inventively, but also because the technology is getting better. And the same is true of CNC, which is computer numerically controlled carving, basically digitally driven routers, which again, Wendell Castle used so beautifully in his late work. So I do think that the relationship between digital technology and handcraft is going to be more and more productive and more of a kind of fascinating dialectic to watch in action. I don't think the hand is going to go away. I think it's always going to be the case that digital tooling is, if you like, just another set of tools, and that traditional tools and traditional skills will still have a huge part to play because, again, that's where a lot of the innovation comes from. The adaptability, the flexibility comes from, inherent human capabilities. But I think that there are some wildly interesting and unpredictable things ahead in terms of how those two different kinds of technology relate to one another. I'm fascinated to see how that develops. The last answer I'll give you, which is very much in line with what we've been talking about already, is that I not only hope but also believe that the diversification that we've seen in what you might call the official craft culture, which is to say the kind of craft culture that's represented at an institution like SAM or the Renwick, or represented by the American Craft Council or the Museum of Arts and Design, where I used to work, that the representation of craft that we see in those kinds of institutions will become more and more diverse, will look more and more like America actually looks. Again, it's not that those histories haven't always been there, but they've often been neglected and they haven't really had the kind of platform that they've deserved at these high profile institutions. And I think that will also, well, it has changed and I think it will continue to go in that direction, which is great. It's probably the most important thing that's happening out there. Same thing is happening in fine art and design right now. Long overdue.
It's very exciting predictions for. I have very similar hopes, so I'm glad to hear that as well. I do actually want to start with a question about a racial group that we didn't mention, but you do touch on in the book, and particularly with West Coast craft. But where do Asians and Pacific Islanders fit into the craft narrative of the United States?
Yeah, so of course, every ethnic group in America is part of the craft history of the nation. We haven't actually mentioned Latino communities either. That's another story I'm keen to tell various ways. And we actually haven't talked a lot about Native American craft in our conversation tonight, but they're more of a sort of prominent story, having, of course, been here at the beginning. And the indigenous story is one that's particularly important to me. But in terms of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, well, one story that leaps to mind, of course, is that of the Japanese internment camps, which is a very disturbing story, one of America's darkest chapters, really. But also some amazing things came out of it. For example, George Nakashima, the great post-war studio furniture maker, was trained. He had already been trained as an architect, but he learned Japanese joinery from this amazing man called Gentaro Hikagawa. Kenneth is his Americanized name, but Gentaro Hikagawa. And he was a traditionally trained Japanese joiner, and he trained Nakashima to use those skills, saws cutting the opposite way, all that stuff. And they made furniture together that was made out of, packing crates and brushwood that they could scavenge in this terrible situation that they were in. Isamu Noguchi was also in an internment camp and had to engage with that situation. So that's one very indelible story that deserves mention, but so many others, there's somebody I'm working on right now actually for a future project. It's not so much from the book, but I'm working on a big project right now about Toshiko Takeizu, who was Hawaiian born but Japanese American, and arguably became the most important post-war ceramic artist working in an abstract expressionist mode. And she really is an abstract expressionist. Volkus was on the edges of that, but it was only really one of the many things he was interested in. He was probably more interested in Picasso and, in fact, Japanese ceramics than he was interested in abstract expressionism narrowly. But that's exactly what Takeizu was doing. She was basically making three-dimensional abstract expressionist paintings, if you like, or sculptures, using the exterior of the pot as her canvas, and very much drawing on Japanese and Chinese ink painting traditions too. So many fascinating people that are part of the story.
Thank you. I'm glad that question brought that up. So thank you to that. So this one I'm gonna throw out to you as a curator who's not tied to any museum anymore. How influential are museums in advancing craft understanding, as opposed to potentially visiting an artist studio? And how does that impact what folks take away from the important craft stories?
Yeah, it's a hard question for me to answer just because I feel like I'm in the eye of the hurricane a little bit. I work in museums so often and galleries also. Gloria, you've been too modest to mention that both of us were involved in a project on Objects USA, the great show that happened 50 years ago and has been kind of now reprised in this exhibition that we worked on together for the for R and Company Gallery in New York. And then I just did a show at Crystal Bridges Museum earlier this year. So I feel like I'm really, really closely tied to these institutions. And boy, I hope they're influential. But I think if they are influential, the reason is because they're reaching the non-converted, right? It's that they actually are, is the whole point of a museum, obviously, is that it's a place where anybody can walk in. This is what's so fantastic about the Smithsonian. It's free, right? You walk in the door with no idea if you're the curator who's going to be coming in the door. And maybe you change somebody's life without even having realized it was happening. And I think that's the way that museums are influential. They're places of discovery, not even so much that they change the way that many, many, many people think through one exhibition. It's that there are individual people that come into the institution and have their life completely altered by the experience, and that it is so unpredictable and increasingly inclusive and accessible. That to me is the magic, and that's why I believe in them so strongly. And as much as museums have been criticized to some extent rightly for being, citadels of authority and didactic and all the rest of it, I still think they have that role to play with craft as well as many other topics.
And thinking about the Renwick Gallery and our Renwick Invitational, we're actually just closing this one. The artists that we bring in those and giving folks that opportunity to see our artists that they might not be able to go see their studios and be able to see what that work is. So I'm gonna side with you on this one. Let's see, what else do we have? Let's see, this one is a long question. All right. This one is a long one, but I think important. So you talk about class and race, and we talked about this at the beginning of the interview, and you discuss it more in detail in your book. And in the context of what Isabel Wilkerson discusses in Caste, what was the impact of the extreme racism, particularly in the South, on what craft work was possible for African Americans? And as we still live in a racist country, how does it continue to impact what Black Americans can accomplish?
Hmm. Well, that's a hard question to answer quickly,
Yes.
because of course the answer is so different when you're talking about different groups of people in different parts of the country and at different dates. I'll just maybe like drill down into a couple of core samples. So just to begin with the experience of enslavement, you'd be really surprised at how skilled enslaved people could be. That's maybe the first thing to say. You know, the famous example is Dave the Potter, so-called David Drake. We tend to call Dave the Potter because Drake was the name of the person that quote owned him. But he was, you know, you could not find a better potter in the annals of American ceramics. And he made all of his work that we know of while he was enslaved. Although he did last, he did live after the Civil War. Um, so the the reality is that enslaved people, as I said earlier, are able to use skill to some extent as a kind of protective mechanism. But of course, they also don't own their own labor, they don't own their own bodies. And so you have a very difficult task in assessing what that would have been like. And I don't know that anybody living today could really say exactly what it would have been like, to have that particular combination of experiences of being masterful and essentially a professional at the top of a trade and also having no rights whatsoever. Um, we go a little bit later, there's the story of African American educational debates. And this is a kind of long one, but very briefly, you have Booker T. Washington on one side of the debate arguing for basically manual training for young Black people, male and female. And then you have others, most famously W.E.B. Du Bois, who argue that Black people should not be manually trained because it encourages a kind of enfranchisement of Black people as a manual laboring underclass, right, a craft underclass. And so there's a lot of debate in terms of what schools should be doing, particularly as African American focused schools are founded during the Reconstruction and after. And just to get to the end of the question, these debates are very much alive and well with us today. You know, how much should we be creating vocational education in cities and towns across the country? How much should we be trying to give everybody equal access to a broader liberal arts education? Really not easy questions to answer, highly political in nature. As you might expect, I sort of come down on the side that everybody should have some exposure to craft training in the same way that everybody should have some exposure to literature and mathematics. I just think it's a fundamental aspect of human capability. And the real trick is to not see them as hierarchical, to see them as all kind of, you know, not equivalent, but equally respectable as trades, and try to also figure out ways to recognize that economically as well, and divorce ourselves from a situation where race is in any way correlated to professional pathways. But boy, is that easier said than done, you know. So we, in so many ways, we're still the inheritors of these massively unfair systems that have existed in this country for so long.
It's going to take a lot of craft to undo systemic issues. Um, so we just have a few more minutes, and I'm going to end on a kind of fun one that we had briefly touched on when you and I talked last week. But how do craft and NFTs come together? And what is the impact of the future of craft with the growth of NFTs as part of the art world?
So the first thing that I'm going to say is this is the second time I've been asked this question on one of these Zoom talks, and the first time I had no idea what an NFT was. So I'm really glad that I've figured that out. So NFT means non-fungible token, and it is, as I think probably almost everyone knows now because there's been so much press around it, even hype. The idea is that you can attach this as a financial instrument to anything. It doesn't have to be a physical object. It doesn't also have to be a digital object, so it can be anything. You know, Jack Dorsey's first tweet on Twitter was sold using an NFT, for example. But you could attach it to a physical object. And what it does is to recognize your ownership of that object, exclusive of any system of recognition otherwise. In other words, a governmental or other financial mechanism for owning things. And what this means in practice is that you can create a purely virtual chair, let's say, and auction it, usually in a cryptocurrency auction, which is how these things have been going so far. And what you win in the auction, if you're successful, is not a physical chair, or even really a virtual chair, because a virtual chair is just out there, right, on a server. What you win is the NFT, which gives you the exclusive ownership of it. And the reason this is important is because it enables commodities to take new forms and also to be insubstantial, which, if you think about it, if we're trying to achieve radical climate change prevention, might turn out to be absolutely crucial. Because if we can, in general, have the value in our economy migrate from physical things to intangible things, then that might in fact be the solution, at least one solution, to having capitalist growth without having ever more impact on the planet. And what people will often say is, yeah, but cryptocurrencies are actually really bad for the environment because of all the data mining and so on. But which is a problem, but people are also working on that and finding solutions that are alternatives to Bitcoin that don't result in that kind of heat generation and electricity consumption. So long story short, there's a broader issue here around the migration of value, as I said, from physical property to intellectual property. And the reason that's interesting in the case of craft is that, of course, we've always been used to the idea that craft is the quintessential example of physical property. It's the object that we can hold in our hands, like I was saying earlier. So will it eventually seem that that attitude, that craft could only be physical, is an artifact of 20th century thinking? And as people get more and more conversant with NFT economies or other forms of digital experience where they're only interacting with an object virtually, as for example, virtual reality becomes more and more practical and more of a commonplace experience, will craft start happening entirely within the virtual realm, both on the production and consumption side? And I don't know the answer to that question. But as we were saying earlier, the dynamic relationship between analog and digital technology is really, really a fascinating one and a productive, generative one. And that's absolutely one of the spheres in which I would expect that to be worked out. Again, very, very early days, like the earliest days of these questions. But I would imagine, I know this is being recorded tonight, but I would imagine if people go back and watch this in 10 years, this is probably the part of the conversation that they'll sort of laugh to themselves about how little they knew, because I think it's going to be changing really, really fast. And a lot of our inherent assumptions about this are probably really wrong. Everybody's assumptions are probably wrong. So for maybe one lucky kid somewhere in India, and we're all going to be proven, the real state of affairs. So it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm totally open to that conversation and think that the idea of a completely virtual craft experience is something to embrace rather than run away from.
All right, I'm going to check back in with you in 10 years and
Yeah,
we'll
let's do
see
that.
where craft and NFTs have intersected. We'll have that conversation. Well, thank you so much, Glenn. It has been an absolute delight to talk with you tonight. Your book is wonderful. I encourage everyone to get a copy. Craft in American History. It's a really wonderful book about how craft kind of touches every single part of our history. And I don't think it's just for craft historians, it's for everyone. So get it for anyone who's interested in how objects matter to our lives and how political history is tied to everything that we touch. So thank you so much for that. Thank you all for being in our audience and joining us this evening. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get to all of your questions, but please do check back our website for future programs, and do remember that you can visit the Renwick and Sam now and reserve your timed passes. Thank you again, Glenn. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
Bye.